And welcome back, everybody, to the Law and Crime Network. You were just listening to some of the prosecution's closing arguments in this case that we've been following very closely out of Florida, involving a man, the defendant, James Colley, who's facing 2 murder charges for allegedly killing his estranged wife and her best friend, his estranged wife, Amanda Colley, and her best friend, Lindy Dobbins. A very, very tragic case of domestic violence. And I'm here, a perfect guest, really, for this, Dan Schorr. He's a former domestic violence prosecutor. When you listen to the 911 call, we were just listening to some of the prosecution's closings. It's very, very hard to listen to. You said this is really a case that is kind of the epitome of a domestic violence case.
Right. It's great to talk with you, Rachel. It's a tragic case. It's chilling to listen to that tape. I've heard hundreds of tapes like that in cases, and this case fits the domestic violence pattern where it's not just one incident, it's a pattern of incidents. He was alleged to have done many things in the past. There's the allegation that he took all of her clothes and burned them. He was in court earlier that day dealing with order of protection issues. He had made phone call threats that also have been part of the case record here. So this was an ongoing pattern, and that's why every domestic violence case that's ongoing has to be viewed as a potential homicide, because that's what can happen here, and you see the horrific results here.
Well, they always say when police respond to domestic violence situations, it seems like something that could be, you know, just screaming, but at the end of the day, when tempers flare like that and you're dealing with emotions in relationships, these are when things get the hottest.
Right, and there's almost always an escalation. I've dealt with misdemeanor domestic violence cases. I've dealt with homicide domestic violence cases. I don't think I've ever seen a homicide in a domestic violence case that didn't have precursor events where there was an escalation. Usually it starts with nonviolent, screaming, controlling, and then escalates to threats, and then hits, slaps, and it escalates to more violence. And then there's often apologies, and there's a whole cycle of violence. And then sometimes you have the tragic circumstances that you have here where people are murdered.
And honestly, I do think it's good that we're airing this trial here on the Law and Crime Network, because so many women across the country go through abuse, and men too, it's not just women, go through domestic violence, and to see it unravel is really terrifying.
Right, and people who are abused often have a sense that, well, it won't escalate any further because the abuser is often apologetic after abuse. There's what's called the honeymoon phase, and there's often a denial that it can keep escalating. And unfortunately, here it sounds like the victim tried to get help. She did all the things to save herself. She went to court. She got an order of protection. She was trying to protect herself, and yet he still persisted.
And we're going to have to be right back. We're going to continue to very closely monitor this trial, and we'll take you back in the courtroom in just seconds. Stay with us. And welcome back. You are listening to the critical prosecution closing arguments in this case that we've been following very closely out of Florida. James Colley, he is the defendant facing murder charges, attempted murder charges for this horrible situation where prosecutors allege he busted into his house in a fit of what appeared to be jealous rage, looking for his estranged wife's new boyfriend, and then ending up killing his estranged wife, Amanda Colley, and her best friend along the way. Dan Schorr, former domestic violence prosecutor. Let's talk about the intent here, okay? Because that's exactly what the prosecution was getting to in those closings, trying to lay out for the jurors very carefully why they should find him guilty of that premeditated factor, that first-degree murder and the 2 counts of attempted first-degree murder.
Right, and he's found guilty of the first-degree murder, then he faces the death penalty. So that, excuse me, that's a big difference than the second-degree murder, where he would face possible life in prison, but that's based on a depraved mind or some kind of other mental state.
And that's exactly why this case went to trial, right? I mean, because there's no dispute here that he's the shooter.
Right.
I mean, you got the 911 tapes. He pretty much admitted to it. But the question is this first degree or is this second degree murder? You're looking at this as a prosecutor with a prosecutor's hat. Could you make a heat of passion argument in this?
You can try, but the thing is, this has been building up for a long time. So heat of passion also is a misnomer in a lot of cases.
Explain, please.
Right. You can't just say, well, I'm angry and I got angry and that's why I did it, because that's motive for a lot of killings. You could say, well, I didn't have the intent to kill, but this kind of depraved action where you're shooting, that's going to lead to murder anyway, so it might be a second-degree charge. But if you premeditate, if you plan it, and remember, planning, intent, that could be formed in just a few minutes. Here, he actually took a gun and he went over there and he went room by room trying to find them, trying to kill them. He had made threats earlier. So it's very consistent with someone who planned this out and tried to kill people.
And the fact that he went room to room, too. He didn't just stop at one room. He continued to seek out trying to find these victims. But wait a second. Rachel Hendricks, that's the attempted murder charge. She's one of the other victims. She didn't die, thank God. He didn't intend to kill her. Maybe maybe she was in the crossfire.
Well, there's also a concept called transferred intent, that if I try to kill you and I hit somebody else, then I could be intentionally killing somebody else because I have the intent to kill even if I killed somebody else. So that's not.
So even if Rachel's not your intended target, you can still face that first degree.
If I have the intent to kill one person and I miss and hit someone else and kill them, that's called transferred intent. That my intent to kill is enough for intentional murder.
Okay, so very good. We're going to get back to more of Rachel Hendricks' testimony right after the break. She's the surviving victim. Just seeing those pictures of that closet where Rachel Hendricks and Lindy Dobbins were inside, terrified as this man who was on a rage with a gun was approaching them. It just brings it home to think, Dan Schorr, of the terror as they're on the other side of that door and this guy is getting closer and closer. And Amanda Colley, the estranged wife, is saying, he's not there, my boyfriend that I'm with, he's not in that closet. It's just Rachel and Lindy.
Right, and he starts shooting through the door. Imagine hiding in a closet where this guy's on a murderous rampage and he's shooting through the closet and he's screaming.
But let's talk about motive there, because we just heard Rachel Hendricks say that Amanda was telling James Colley who was in the closet. And he knew. So he knew that it was not Lamar, the boyfriend, that it was the other two, the two women.
Right, but for some reason he wanted to kill them anyway, according to the prosecution, because he pointed a gun at the closet where they were, and he went in and ended up shooting one of them point blank and killing her.
In the head. And Rachel Hendricks, who you just saw on the stand-in, we'll hear more from her.
She got grazed. She
got grazed, exactly. But still, just very terrifying. One thing that both of us noticed as we were watching that testimony is she seemed very calm. Did that strike you as odd in any way?
It was a little unusual, but that's just her personality and how she's handling this. There's no textbook for how you're supposed to respond when you're hiding in a closet and someone's shooting at you and killing your friends, and then you have to testify about it later. Some people react more stoic when they have to recount it in court. Some people are crying. But there's different ways to deal with that trauma. Obviously, this is something she's going to live with for the rest of her life. No human being can get past this totally, what she went through. Yeah, and like you said, everyone deals with these differently. Some people break down on the stand, as we've seen. Some people, are able to keep it together. I thought she was rather stoic. But in terms of the case, how impactful is testimony like that? It's really important. There's really two parts to this. One is emotionally, the jury will understand the terror the victims went through. And when they're considering first-degree murder, which is the premeditated killing, versus second-degree, which is more depraved mind, this helps the first degree, even though it may not establish the element of intent. Certainly the passion that the jury will sense from the fear they had will go towards the fact that he was intending to kill them, because there was a lot of time that went by as this was proceeding. It wasn't just a very quick thing. He had time to think about it. He had time to find the closet. He had time to shoot multiple times. That all goes to intent. And then second of all, it's important in terms of hearing the details, because there's no replacement for the jury hearing the details from someone who actually saw it. When everyone is deceased in a murder scene, you have to have other people talk about the details. But when there's a survivor, you could actually hear firsthand account of what it was like, and that is really, really powerful. We're going to get to more of Rachel Hendricks' testimony in just a minute, and she's going to actually describe the moment that she was shot, what it was like, what she was doing in that small closet. And we saw just a few minutes ago pictures of the closet. It's really, really hard to listen to, but very, very important stuff. We're going to get to more of her testimony in just a second, and I'm also going to be talking about why did this case even go to trial. We'll be back in just a minute. Rachel Hendricks, she ran out of the closet. She heard a shot, and it was Lindy Dobbins that was dead.
Lindy Dobbins was just one of the 2 victims in this case. Amanda Colley, also a murder victim, and her best friend, Lindy. Amanda Colley's husband, or I should say estranged husband, James Colley, is the one who is now on trial in this Florida case, Dan Schorr. When you talk about evidence against a defendant here, I mean, you can't get much more than this. You have surviving witnesses, you have 911 calls, you have these text messages that we talked about before that he sent. Why did this go to trial?
The prosecution seeking the death penalties, and that's what this case is about. The defendant can't and won't plead guilty and be executed, but he's going to be facing some kind of murder conviction. We'll have to see, but there's no way.
Yeah, I think so.
There's no way that he can be acquitted of all charges when everyone has seen him do it. When 2 people have eyewitnessed it, when there's the motive through text messages and voicemails, when there's other evidence. But the reason this is at trial, it's about the defense wanting to save his life, wanting him to either be convicted of second-degree murder instead of first-degree murder, so it's not the intentional premeditated murder that carries the death penalty, or at the death penalty phase, trying to establish and just get 1 juror to not vote for the death penalty. That's all they need.
And of course, we'll get into more of this in a bit, this whole Ambien defense that he initially tried to use, that he was high on Ambien. But we'll talk about that in a bit. Now, I want to switch gears because James Colley, who's the defendant in this case, tried to escape after this happened, and he drove to Virginia where he was arrested. And I want to play some testimony from a special agent there in the Virginia area who searched his car, James Colley's car, after he was pulled over and arrested. Let's take a listen. All right, wow, that is some pretty damning evidence there, Dan Schorr. You got the bullets, you got a gun, you got an AR-15 heavy-duty weapon there. What does this kind of testimony do to the case, real quickly, before we go to break?
First of all, it shows that he had weapons. So putting aside, there are already eyewitnesses and people putting him at the scene. But let's say you don't have that, and he says, I wasn't there, wasn't me. Well, you have all these weapons that are consistent with what was used at the crime. Second of all, it shows he's an ongoing safety threat. If he wasn't caught at that point, what would have happened? He's running around the car with all these weapons.
Excellent point. What could have this man done if it wasn't for the police catching him? We'll be right back with more testimony inside this Florida courtroom. All right, you were just listening to the sister of James Colley, and she's important to this story because she had guns in her vehicle that James Colley used, the vehicle he used to escape after the alleged murders. I'm here alongside Dan Schorr, a former prosecutor and now a investigator. Let's talk a little bit about her testimony, and why are we getting so hung up about the fact that she left the guns in the car? Wouldn't it have been safer if you had left them in the house, locked them up? Why didn't you have a gun safe? I'm kind of curious. First of all, we don't know for sure, and I'm trying to figure out. I think at least one of the guns was used in the shooting.
Right.
Not sure, but why does it matter?
Well,
I don't get it.
At the end of the day, it probably does not matter, but you are trying to connect this defendant to weapons that he might have used in the killing and to show his access to weapons, using the weapons' dangerousness. On cross-examination, a witness is going to be cross-examined on bad judgment, on inconsistencies, even if those inconsistencies and possible bad judgment don't go to the ultimate fact of the defendant's intent, which is really what's at issue here. So it's kind of tangential. It does help support the prosecution's case, but remember, we have the defendant making threats. We have the defendant on site, witnessed by 2 surviving people as committing this crime. So the important parts of connecting him to the weapons, yeah, that's important, but that's not the crux of the case that's going to lead to a verdict.
Yeah, and I get that you try to kind of disparage the prosecution's witness at every turn in terms of why didn't you do this, why didn't you do that. However, at the end of the day, does it matter that she did a stupid thing and left her guns in her vehicle instead of doing what she should have done, which is lock them up in her house when she went on a 2-week vacation to Italy?
I think to answer that question, you have to think the ultimate goal here is to save the defendant's life. And to do that, you need 1 juror not to convict of first-degree murder or 1 juror not to vote for the death penalty. So any little nugget, like he was emotional and the sister's recklessness helped contribute to his access to a weapon, you know, anything that like that you could could get one juror to grab onto and say, okay, maybe we shouldn't execute him or convict him of first-degree murder. That's what the defense is going for here. So they're going to try every little thing to try to alleviate some responsibility from the defendant.
Yikes, Dan, if you ever had a first-degree murder case, you have, I mentioned this earlier, you had the words of the defendant just right before the shooting to his estranged wife. You are you are effing disgusting, you effing whore. That is what he said in the moments leading up to this shooting.
So you have to grab onto these little things because you don't have any big things to grab on, right?
Exactly.
You need to grab on all these little things, and one juror sides with you.
Absolutely. Okay, we're going to continue very closely monitoring this case. We'll take you back inside the Florida courtroom in just minutes. Stay with us.